Well, it's International Father's Day today. Oftentimes in my own home, my husband complains that there are at least 4 different Mother's Days, and there's just one Father's Day. So it's a big deal, really. And it really should be a big deal, especially in Nigeria today, maybe most of the world, where absentee fathers have become a way of life. And some of the ills of society could be traceable to it, because my guest on the show has found out in the course of her work that actually absent fathers and the role models they are for their sons could be responsible for some of the social ills. Do you agree? Well, we'll meet them in a short while on Seriously Speaking. You're welcome. Yes, welcome back. The first person you're going to meet on the show today is someone that's called Kemi DaSilva-Ibru. However, she's a daughter of a doctor, but she tells me that's not why you became a doctor. It's nice. Let me welcome you first on the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's nice to have you.
So you did ask me before we started, why medicine?
Why medicine?
And I said very simply one word: empathy. Even as a child, I always put myself in that position of that other individual, that other child.
How did you be like that?
I don't know. I think I was one of those curious children. I was always asking the why questions. Why is that happening to this person?
When you see
an underprivileged person. Or why is it that, we can do this way, but then that person can't? So I was one of those, I guess, annoying little children that would keep asking mom and dad, so why and why and why?
Why do I have 2 shoes and that person doesn't have 1?
Or just curious as to why they don't have shoes. Let's start with that, and why can't we get them shoes, and how can we get them shoes, and so on and so forth.
So it's not a surprise that you started WARIF, because, you started WARIF, which is the Women
at Risk International Foundation.
And the whole idea was because of rape. And tell me about why WARIF started.
Well, as you said, WARIF is a non-profit organization. It was established in 2016 by myself. And I think, very simply, to address the high incidence of the rape, sexual violence, and trafficking of young girls and women across many communities in Nigeria. Now, me personally, my background, as you said, is obstetrics and gynecology.
I'm surprised about that, though, because, that's one area most doctors, female doctors, is tedious,
it's
long hours.
Long hours. And I moved back 10 years ago. And when I moved back, my very first thought was start in the public sector, not the private sector, because to practice medicine. Reason being that 90% of the population are served in the public sector. Yeah. And our healthcare concerns typically arise from the issues in the public sector. So I started working in Ikeja, in one of the general hospitals. And very early, I noticed disenfranchised groups of young girls and women that would come in complaining of one assault, one violent encounter, but there was just no infrastructure available to attend to them. Now, this was 10 years ago. Since then, especially in Lagos State, we've come a long way in terms of offering infrastructure to these young girls. But then they would be met with a matron that was suspicious. Oftentimes, they'd be asked to repeat their story over and over again. There would be a lot of suspicion as to why it is that she was in that place or that space, what she was wearing. And then she would be treated as best as you could. Often Band-Aid, cuts and bruises attended to, and then she'd be sent back home. Now, the narrative tells us that home is the place of abuse. And 90% of the time, the perpetrator is that caregiver. And so oftentimes, you would have that cycle repeat itself, but she probably won't come back to that healthcare facility because of the way she was treated the first time that she came in. And so I would help in my medical capacity. Back then, I was working, as I said, in the public sector, moved on to the private sector, and still offered my services pro bono until 2016. And my tipping point was a really sad case with a 2-year-old that we had to take into the operating room to address the injuries that was incurred by her father. And shortly thereafter, we had an 11-year-old that was pregnant, and we had the challenges of having to deliver her via C-section or not, because she'd been raped by an uncle from age 9 and missed a period. And so I went home and I said to my husband, well, I needed a vehicle, because right now, there's only so much I could do in my health capacity, my medical capacity. But then I needed a more holistic approach in addressing this issue. And this was how the Women at Risk International Foundation was born.
Well, I followed your work, and I wonder, like some people wonder though, Is this a case of, well, she has a lot of money and so she can do that?
Far from it. I mean, my husband's pulling his hair out. The truth is, you feel compelled. I mean, I was in a situation where I, by virtue of my position as an OBGYN specialist, my exposure to different groups of women through wonderful organizations that are already working in the space, churches and other well-intentioned women, seeing the awful atrocities that happen to these young girls and women. And realizing that, you know, every little helps. And so I wanted to add to whatever assistance that was already available for these young women and girls.
So at personal cost?
Initially.
Well, how easily is it to convince people to support you, though? Because, I mean, the
it's a big
NGO
ask.
world has...
It's a big ask. The NGO world, as you can imagine, I mean, it's a limited pool, and there's a huge need. And there's a long list of different organizations that have different interests, but they're just as important as mine, although in my opinion, mine's the most important. But the need is huge. I mean, in environments like Lagos, 21 million people, countries like Nigeria, 190 million people, 1 in 4 girls before the age of 18 would have had at least one violent sexual encounter.
And you have facts to prove that, because you've seen it personally.
We've seen it personally. This is a UNICEF study that we typically would say would be the most recent national statistics we have. However, at the WARIF, we run a series of routine questionnaires and studies to identify and measure whether or not this need is actually real. And we did confirm that 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 8 boys before the age of 18.
Which brings me to the question why we're talking about this today. Because the thing is, in the course of all this research that you've done, you've found out that actually there's a gap in the boys sector. So you started doing something for boys as well. Tell me about that.
So what happened was the foundation works on 3 main pillars, one of which is education. And under the educational pillar, we were addressing curricula specifically to girls. And we were going into secondary schools and seeing adolescent young girls, and through the WARIF Educational School Program, changing their narrative by empowering them and giving them a toolkit to prevent sexual assault and rape. But at some point in time, we became aware of the fact that it's one thing to talk to girls about not getting raped, but then we have that young boy who sees his father brutalize, abuse his mom. He oftentimes wonders whether it's right or wrong, but there's nobody around him to tell him that this is the wrong sort of behavior. He goes to church, no one corrects the behavior. And so chances are, already living in an environment such as Nigeria that is patriarchal, and there is that gender disparity that we see every day, he will probably become that potential perpetrator or abuser when he reaches adulthood. So we needed to start looking at that boy and changing his story and changing his narrative.
And you've taken stars and, you know, people in...
So what we did was we started the Boys Conversation Cafe. That's the name of the initiative. And very simply, we put together cohort groups of young boys in secondary schools, mostly in the public secondary schools. And we engage them through a role model, a mentor, who's given guidelines by the WARIF organization. Because there is no curriculum, Adesuwa, for boys. And so right now what we've done is we've had to go into these schools, engage these boys, and through focal group discussions, identify what these issues are that they need to have and need to change their story.
Fortunately, in the studio with us, we have some man who I regard to be a role model to the extent that he's an exemplary young man. And I mean, you have such people also role modeling for you.
Yes,
so I'll take a break, and when we come back, we talk about how we realize that role modeling may be the problem when it comes to young men. Is that okay?
Sounds good.
I'll be back with my guests in a minute. Now you're going to wonder what makes me conclude that my next guest is a good father. Very simple. We've done a report on Today's Woman once, and we were looking for fathers who were exemplary, and he was one of the names that popped up. And I saw how involved he was in raising his 2 kids. You still have 2 kids now? Have they increased? A boy and a girl. So Oguche is joining Kemi on the set now. Oguche, it's nice to have you.
Nice to be here.
And this is one man that the photo on his DP is his wife's own. I kept on thinking it was his wife's number. And I'm like, why do you have her phone, her picture on your phone as your DP?
Well, I guess she's my princess.
Your wife is your princess?
Yeah, she's my princess.
Lovely answer.
And I always try to make that clear to her and also to my kids, because I always want my kids to see the way I treat their mom, because once it's ingrained in their mind, especially for my son, he begins to want to treat his wife like that and other women like that.
How did you become like that?
I deliberately, I don't know, I think it comes from generations. I saw my dad do that to my mom. You know, my dad, you know, I think my mom is the best thing that happened to him, and it sort of happens naturally. What you see happen is that people repeat the things that they see.
Kemi just said that. I thought it was statistics.
Yeah, they might not know it, but they repeat things that they see. I mean, when I gave birth to my son, I wrote an article.
You gave birth to your son? Come on, Kemi.
When we had our son.
I mean, you have to give your wife some credit for giving birth to your son.
I drove
when I watched my son come.
How about that? How about we say when you watched your son be delivered?
Okay, I drove her to the hospital. I was in labor with her.
Okay, and we held her hand. When you watched your son be delivered by someone such as myself.
Okay, sorry.
So I think whatever we achieve in life, if you fail as a parent, I think you failed. For me, I think that's the greatest role that we have as human beings, to give something to the next generation. Because if we are gone, it's the values that we put in our kids that's the most important. I remember when I was young, my dad used to read in the car when we were going to school. He's always...
So dad's still alive?
He's still alive.
She's giving an award, okay.
Yeah, and I realized that I found myself reading in the car also.
To your kids?
Yeah, so it just happened naturally. I didn't have to.
Hey guy, what kind of job do you do that you have time to read to your kids in the car?
Yeah, on the way to school, I drove them at school.
So you do school run?
Yeah, I do school run.
See what I mean? I didn't even know that.
My father used to do school run too.
So it's back to what you're saying.
Years.
It's back to what you're saying about what. So in the course of your work now, what have you found out from these young boys? The role model.
My work, violence begets violence. That's the first thing. So exactly what Oguche was saying. I mean, if you give a child an enabling environment, and you correct the child, and you start at a young age, at the formative age, where it's impressionable, and you can start changing the attitudes and the mindset, then you will be able to change the story. So what we're finding now is that between those ages of 12 and 18, the boys that we talk to do engage in rather irresponsible behavior. What we do is we run like baseline surveys prior to the
And do you go to public schools? Or?
We go to only the public schools. And a significant percentage of them do admit to using drugs, drinking alcohol, watching porn and pornography, and as I said, engaging in behavior that would be, if you will,
antisocial or negative?
Well, maybe on antisocial, because deviant might be a bit extreme. But yes, behavior that, is untoward, and behavior that would encourage that young boy when he becomes an adult in, unsavory behavior such as rape and assault.
Just to both wind up, our last words, if nobody remembers anything about this conversation, what would you want them to remember?
I think with regards to the young boys that we help.
And all the work that you do.
Yeah, just, believe in our youth. Believe that we can change that story, and we can change that young boy's mindset.
I would say put your money where your mouth is too, and support WARIF.
Absolutely, that's a better ending.
What about you?
I'd say family is very, very important, and the things that you do or don't do can affect generations deep. You don't know how, those actions that you do.
Especially our fathers.
Your son is watching.
So can we just collectively say Happy Father's Day to all the fathers?
So
Happy Father's Day to all the fathers out there. So hopefully dysfunctional families will be a thing of the past, but it has to be individualized. We have to start from ourselves and be the change that we want to see. We'll see you again next week. It's been Seriously Speaking.